Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to the Vivekananda Study Circle of IISc Bangalore and also at the IITs. Let me begin by this story or this incident of how Vivekananda indirectly may have had an influence on the physics of the 20th century. And the story goes back to, I believe it was 1898, when the famous French actress, Sarah Bernhardt, she was traveling with her troupe to New York. And she invited Vivekananda, who was also in New York at that time, and Nikola Tesla to a party. And at this party, the two of them met, and we have a record of their meeting in a note that Tesla made in his diary, which has been published, and also letters that Vivekananda wrote to his disciples. And so apparently what happened at that meeting, at the party thrown by Sarah Bernhardt, was that Vivekananda sat with Tesla and talked about his understanding of what physics was. And this was, of course, the understanding which all literate Indians until perhaps the period of independence, all literate Indians used to have about the tradition. And so what Vivekananda told Tesla was that, look, according to Indian physics, it should be possible to convert matter into energy. And I do know, and as you're all aware, Tesla was the most famous engineer, scientist in America at that point in history, because his standard of alternating current had won over Edison's pushing of direct current for commercial use. And his invention of the induction motor was a very major thing in technology at that particular point. And Tesla had been interested in this idea of transmission of energy wirelessly. And also, of course, he had visualized or he was to visualize connecting of all of the world through such wireless connection, which would also provide information. So Vivekananda told him that, look, according to my physics or according to Indian physics, it is possible to convert matter into energy. So if you do so, not only would it make it possible for you to realize your dream related to transmission of energy through wireless, but it will also establish Indian physics on a more sound basis, to the extent that the West would then be able to appreciate all its different aspects. Now, we do know that Tesla was unable to do this, was unable to find the equations connecting energy and mass. And we do know that Einstein wrote his famous E=mc² paper in 1905, which was perhaps 7 years after this meeting. But now some American scholars have speculated that Tesla, is the most famous Serbian of his times, had Mileva Einstein, that is Einstein's first wife, as a correspondent, and he probably suggested that this is a problem worthy of study. And of course, we do know that Einstein was able to do this, and to this extent, Vivekananda played a role, or one can speculate he played a role in the unfolding of physics of the 20th century. Now, I want to dwell a couple of minutes here on what is Indian physics, or what is it that people like Vivekananda and possibly Jagdish Chandra Bose and S.N. Bose and Meghnath Saha, or perhaps C.V. Raman, we can only speculate. What did they think Indian physics was, if at all they were fully aware of all its dimensions? Well, Indian physics is this tradition which goes back to Kanada. Kanada, who is dated generally to about 500–600 BCE, and Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutra is the beginning of the physics tradition, because, as you know, the various darshanas and the other shastras that we have as a part of Indian tradition are a summary of the Indian sciences, and these sciences cover a whole broad spectrum. And Vaisheshika is a summary of Indian physics, say at about 500 or 600 BCE. Now, what is astonishing in my view is that most Indians are not aware of Vaisheshika Sutras. Most Indians now, post-independence, because post-independence something absolutely remarkable happened. India decided to separate itself from its own scientific tradition, and doing so, I think it has hurt India tremendously, because if you talk to any truly leading scholar, leading physicist or scientist in the West, they do not only do the equations associated, or the experiments associated with their immediate science, but they also make an attempt to go back to the very foundations, that is the epistemology, that is the way of knowing in the field of sciences. And so we see the best of Western sciences going back to the origins of science in Europe, and not only that, and also going to the very origins of science in India, while very sadly Indians decided not to do that, and that has had a very major impact, in my view, a negative impact on the development and growth of Indian science in the last 70 years. But now I'll come back to this point a few times further, but let me speak very briefly to what is it that is contained in Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras. And I must also say that in the 9th class textbook on Indian physics of NCERT, there is only one line devoted to Kanada, and that line is totally incorrect. That line states that Kanada came up with the idea of atoms, and the basis of this idea was that if you keep on dividing matter, the smallest portion of this matter is what an atom is. And this is, of course, not what Kanada did. And this again tells us the very sad situation that we have texts for school students under the signature of leading Indian scientists who haven't taken the care to find out what is it that Kanada actually said. So what is it that Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras say? The Vaisheshika Sutras have certain general principles in them related to knowledge, and it has laws of motion which almost are identical. The two of the three are identical to Newton's laws of motion, and we do laud or praise Newton's laws of motion, but we don't say anything about Kanada's laws. And then he also speaks about atoms. Now, what are his laws of motion? For example, Newton's third law, you have karya virodhi karma, which means action has reaction. Karma is reaction. That is what it normally means. And karya is action. To every action, there is an equal reaction. Karanat abhavat karya abhavaha. Without cause, you cannot have action. Karma sadhyam na vidyate. From action, no other action can come. So in other words, if there is a certain process, there's no other process which is outside of this process that can emerge. Or sanyoga abhave gurutvat patanam, that without joining together, things will fall. In other words, a mention of gravitation. Nodan abhavat nagamanam, without force, you cannot have a new action. So these are general principles related to motion, and Kanada also mentions that all the properties of matter can be obtained through an interplay of a triad, and these triad are padartha, karma, and guna, which means substance, attributes or properties, and their motions, which is very modern, that all of physics should be determinable out of properties of substances and their motions, right? Which is precisely how modern physics works. But then he also says that as far as our understanding of all of this is concerned, there is another triad, and this triad is of samanya, vishesha, and samavaya. Samanya is what is universal. You can thus infer that an atom should be spherical, because from all perspectives it should look the same. So this is a kind of an invariance law. So samanya vishesha, which depends on the specific location of the observer in relation to the process, which is the relative perspective, which we know was spoken by Aryabhata in his Aryabhatiya in relation to motion, for example, of somebody on a boat and somebody on the bank of a river, and Galileo's relativity, and of course much later on by Poincaré and Einstein. So the basic idea of the specific significance of the observer was also stressed by Kanada. Now, Kanada speaks of 4 kinds of atoms, and in fact, he speaks of these atoms from the perspective of the 5 bhutas. He says there is the Prithvi atom, there is the Apaha atom, there is the Tejas atom, and then there is the Vayu atom. And without going into the details, most of the mass is from the Prithvi atom, and then there is some from the Apaha atom, and the commentaries that there are also indicate that the Tejas atom and the Vayu atom do not have any mass. Now, is the Prithvi atom, Earth? The Apaha atom, is it water? No. What he argues is this. He says, look at gold, and gold is normally solid, but when you heat it, it becomes liquid, which means that the Apaha atom, which was already a part of gold, is now manifested itself, which means all matter has both the Prithvi atom and the Apaha atom, just like proton and electron. And then when you heat it further, it starts to burn, and therefore the Tejas atom, which is from which light comes out, the process of burning, the flame. So the Tejas atom was also originally a part of the solid gold, and now it has manifested itself because of the energy that you have put in. And finally, if you leave gold aside, slowly over a long time, it will probably lose some of its mass, because that is the Vayu atom, which is also a constituent of this matter, goes away. So this is the way it was sort of put as to how these atoms work. So it's a totally different from what the 9th class textbook of NCERT puts it, because these atoms are different, and it's an amazing coincidence that these atoms do correspond to the standard physics model that we have, in which you have most of the mass coming from proton, and then some coming from electron, and then you have the photons, which is the Tejas atom, and then you have the neutrino, which also doesn't have mass, which corresponds to the Vayu atom. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is what was already contained in Kanada's Sutras. What I'm suggesting is that there is this analogy which seems to carry through, and the least that it requires is that we should be aware as to what the thinking was, and through reasoning alone, Kanada and the other rishis had come up with this understanding. Now, the other triad that I mentioned of Samanya, Vaisheshika, and Samavaya. Samavaya is the point of the interaction of the observer with the observed, of the observer with materiality. So there is a divide, as we know in Vedanta as well. There's a divide between the observer and the observed. There's also this divide in physics as well. Even if you consider Newtonian physics, the observer is always outside of the equations of Newtonian physics. There is no mention of how is it that the observer is able to understand or make sense or participate in the Newtonian world. And likewise, in relativity, the observer is always is always outside of the system. And in quantum mechanics as well, the observer and the observed form two sides of the same picture. And if you look at the orthodox Copenhagen interpretation, where there was a substantial thought given to this very question, it was concluded that, and this is the orthodox interpretation, that the two are the two sides, like the two sides of a coin. And as you know, Schrödinger himself, one of the creators of quantum mechanics, himself credited Vedanta, as in the Upanishads, as in the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, which he claimed gave him the central idea of the quantum mechanical framework, that the quantum mechanical state is a superposition of all possibilities. So he thought that that idea was already a part of Vedanta. And as we know, it's generally accepted by those who subscribe to the the mainstream, the dominant interpretation of quantum mechanics, that that quantum mechanics and Vedanta are quite consistent with each other. In fact, you'll see this specific statement in the biography of Schrödinger, the well-known huge biography of Schrödinger by Moore, that where it's stated that the general belief is that quantum mechanics and Vedanta are perfectly consistent with each other. So there are also questions, and some of these questions are: if agents are outside of the framework, if consciousness is outside of the framework of physics, how do the two of them interact? And my late friend, the famous Indian physicist from Kerala, George Sudarshan, in the 1970s wrote a paper called, along with his student Misra, wrote a paper called The Quantum Zeno Effect, where he argued that by observation alone, the state of a quantum state can either be frozen, or in other words, its evolution can be stopped, or later on, you can also show, or other people have shown, that the state can in fact be steered to whichever way you want by observation alone without any expenditure of energy. And this quantum Zeno effect has been demonstrated in the lab, and but at many different places, and you can Google it and find more information on it. And what's interesting is that this is something which is a part of the Vedanta tradition in India for centuries and centuries. And a few centuries ago, it was formally written up as the Drishti Srishti Vada. The question arose in scholarly circles within India, that how is it that Ishvara, or the deity, or Vishnu, or the goddess, how is it that the deity is able to intervene in a physical process? Because all physical processes, all natural processes, according to the Vedas, are governed by rhythm, by laws, by the whole chain of cause, of karana. So if everything is determined by karanas, by laws, by the past, how is it that there is any place for freedom, or there is any place for Ishvara? So the answer is the Drishti Srishti Vada, that Ishvara, just by observation, by his Drishti, is able to create, is able to intervene in a creative way in a process, or create the entire universe as it is. And in fact, this is not only 3 or 4 or 5 centuries ago. This is a very ancient tradition which goes back, for example, in the process of Tantra, in Sri Vidya, in Kashmir Shaivism, going all the way to the very framework that you have in the Upanishads and in the Vedas itself, where you have Rudra, for example, the famous dialogue in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where Yagyavalkya speaks of the 33 devas, and of the 33 devas, 11 are the Rudras, and the Rudras are the different aspects of consciousness in its concealment and its expression. And these 11 Rudras, as we also know, were added to the very framework of the 25 tattvas of Sankhya in the 36 tattvas of Shaiva Darshan, or Kashmir Shaivism. So you have this whole thought process which goes back into centuries BCE, and therefore we can see how this was a part of Vaisheshika. Now, later on in Vaisheshika, since I already mentioned that everything is supposed to emerge out of these anus of the atoms, and these atoms can form dyads, or they can find very different combinations, which lead to chemistry, and therefore chemistry was an extension of physics in this framework. And some of all this material, through writings of many different individuals that we have in various texts, was summarized in a book that one Professor Seal wrote, I think Brajnath Seal, or B.N. Seal, wrote, I think in the 1910s, called The Positive Sciences of the Hindus. So you can go back and look at the Sanskrit originals in various aspects related to both physics and chemistry in that particular text. Now, so we've covered Kanada, the beginning, and I spoke very briefly about Aryabhata's relativity theory, and about 1200 BCE, you have Jyotish as a Vedanga, which is Jyotish Vedanga of Lagadha, where you have the motions of the sun and the moon. And then, of course, we have the various Siddhantas going back to Surya Siddhanta, which, of course, as we know, was revised at many particular moments in history. And then you have the great acharyas such as Aryabhata and Brahmagupta. And of course, there was a lot of math which was also emerging, and that math goes back all the way to the Shulba Sutras. And as in the introduction it was mentioned, my own work in the study of all of these texts revealed a astronomy which had been forgotten for maybe 3,000 years. And this astronomy is to be seen in the very organization of the Rig Veda and the other texts. And you can read up the details of it, or details on it, in my book, The Astronomical Code of the Rig Veda, but it was also published in dozens of scholarly journals, both in India and the West. For example, Vistas in Astronomy in Britain, the Royal Astronomical Society, the Mankind Quarterly, the Journal of Indian Journal of History of Science, and many others, both in the East and the West. And basically, to summarize it, the great ritual, which is called the Agni Chayan ritual, which is still performed, incidentally, in certain parts of India, in Kerala especially, and in Maharashtra. So in that ritual, a 5-layered altar was constructed in the shape of an eagle, or shen in Sanskrit. 5-layered because these are a representation of the cosmos, and the eagle represents time. And it was to be done in a particular way over a period of 95 years, which is of course theoretical. And the whole idea was, which I was able to explain, was to represent the motions of the sun and the moon. And this is an important problem because, as we know, the lunar calendar was at the basis of a lot of the rites that were performed. But then you have the motion of the sun, which has the cyclicity of 365 days plus a fraction, and the motion of the moon, which is a cyclicity of 354 days and a fraction. And so there is a difference, and that difference of 11 days was an important part of the details of this ritual. And these details were also expressed in the very structure of the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda consists of 1017 suktas, or the hymns, plus 11 extra ones, additional ones. So 1017 is 339 times 3, because the Vedic system is this triple division of Bhu, Bhuva, Swaha, the earth, the atmosphere, and the sun, or the skies. And so if you divide 1017 by 3, you get 339. And it so turns out that on a equinox day, where the night and day are equal. If you look at the disk of the sun from sunrise to sunset, you will have exactly 339 disks, and that would be true if the sun were 108 times its diameter from the Earth, which is what it is. So if the radius is 108, the half circle is pi into r. Pi into 108 is 339. And the moon is also 108 times its diameter from the Earth, which is why the moon's radial size is the same as that of the sun, which is why you have the eclipse. And it so turns out, modern astronomy tells us that the diameter of the sun is about 108 times the diameter of the Earth. And all this was, of course, expressed through the equation of the Pinda and the Brahmanda, of the self and the entire cosmos, Atman and the Brahman, as is repeated so many times in the Upanishads. It was expressed in the flight, so to speak, that one was to make in one's own sadhana, in one's own discovery of oneself, from the Earth, which is your body, which is your Annamaya Kosha, from the Earth to the Atman within, which is 108 steps away, which is why you have 108 beats in the Japamala. So you're making a symbolic journey from your body into to the sun within, because just as you have the outer sun, you have the inner sun, which is that you might call Vishnu or Shiva or the Devi. So you make that symbolic journey. And likewise, you have 108 names of the god or the goddess. You have 108 karanas in Bharatanatyam, which were described in Natya Shastra, which again goes back into centuries BCE. So there's this whole framework, a very sophisticated framework, which first of all perceived the outer universe, and the perception was that this is infinite. And you have many systems, many solar systems. There are many suns, and so on. Something which where the possibility of life on other systems in modern science is very recent, in the 1990s, with the discovery of exoplanets. But this is already a part of this entire system, and this is where there is, first of all, a very clear and sophisticated understanding of the observer as apart from the observed, and the awareness of the many paradoxes that exist. And these paradoxes are parallel to the paradoxes that we have in modern science. For example, mathematics and logic, and the very idea of paradox or paroksha, this divide between pratyaksha and paroksha, that ultimately not everything can be put within the framework of a linguistic system, because what is linguistic is completely descriptive, which is what is in Mundaka Upanishad called apara vidya. So it's linguistic, it's about things, but consciousness is not a thing. Consciousness, therefore, will always be totally a part of a paroksha system. You can only intuit it, and that's why it's a paravidya. It's not an aparavidya. So within the Indian physical or physics or scientific shastric tradition, there's always been total clarity that consciousness is not material. And this is one of the very central ideas of Indian science. And there are paroksha beyond which consciousness is hidden. But this also takes you to the entire world of sadhana, or one's own development, because the idea is that within each sentient being is the same Atman, as all of you are aware. And therefore, potentially, each human being is a genius, But why isn't every human being a genius? Because people are separated from their true selves. They don't know who they are, and therefore they operate only through their mind. And if their mind doesn't have clarity, they are not able to see things for what they are. And that's the reason why there is ignorance. Ignorance or darkness is a consequence of the avaran, or the covering that covers the manas or mind, and therefore and as an extension to this whole line of thinking, all kinds of infinite possibilities should become available to any human being if they are able to uncover, and that uncovering requires a lot of manthan, so to speak, and that's what the iconic Samudra Manthan, which takes place within each heart, or the Kurukshetra battle that must take place between the Asuras and the Devas within each individual. It's out of that battle, it's out of that Manthan that lens, so to speak, of the mind finds that clarity. And through that clarity, then you can see, no matter what you apply your gaze to, whether you're looking at physical phenomena, whether you're doing psychology, whether you're a poet, or whatever you are, you see that total clarity, and you then are able to find out or do exactly what you are supposed to do, or do things with an insight which help you find mastery. So this is certainly also a part of one's own journeying in one's life, because we are not just individuals by ourselves, we are also part of society, of the entire world, and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is of course from the Mahanarayan. No, it's not from Mahanarayan. It's one of the Upanishads, one of the great Upanishads. So this statement that we are all a family comes in from there as well. Now, I also want to speak to the contribution of Bhaskaracharya very briefly. I mentioned that Kanada himself speaks about the Gurutvat Patanam, that he speaks of attraction. Now, of course, people spoke about gravity everywhere, that things are falling, that's because of gravity. But what was central to the whole idea of gravity, which made it into a modern science, was this idea that this is a universal force. It's not that Earth is central and things are falling on center, which is what was Aristotle's error, which is why Earth was made central to reality, to the whole physical world, and which led to the European and Arab sciences becoming constricted, and which led to people who challenged this orthodoxy being burnt at stake, like Bruno in Italy. While in India, the whole idea was that the world was infinite, but the specific statement that Gurutwakarshan was a universal law is to be found. Now, it's quite possible that Kanada himself believed in it, but there is no statement by him. There's no statement by Aryabhata or Brahmagupta which says so clearly, or in Surya Siddhanta. But Bhaskaracharya mentions very clearly that, look, there are certain objects in space which don't fall because they also are attracted by other objects in space, and therefore their attraction gets balanced out, which is a very clear statement related to the universality of gravitation law, which is of course also the crucial contribution of Newton. As you know, the inverse square law was mentioned by others, before Newton also, and there was this big controversy about who was first, Newton or somebody else. So what was the main contribution of Newton was to speak of its universality, but as we see, that universality was described by Bhaskaracharya himself, although as we do also know that Bhaskara did not have the inverse squared law equation in his system, and therefore we must praise Europe for that particular discovery. Now, how we see the scientific revolution, or how historians see the dawning of the scientific revolution, it's normally perceived in the development of calculus. Calculus made all the difference. Before calculus, there were conceptual schemes, but there was no conceptual schemes in relation to physics or relation to engineering and so on. But these conceptual schemes were limited because we did not have the mathematics to go beyond a certain stage in their analysis. And what made the difference, what brought about the scientific revolution, was the development of calculus, which rests ultimately on infinite series. So it's the infinite series of Leibniz and Newton, which are viewed as the dividing point between the pre-scientific revolution era and the scientific revolution era, or modern science. Now, as we all know, at least 300 or 400 years prior to Leibniz and Newton, in the Kerala School of Mathematics and Astronomy, infinite series were developed. And therefore, India was 2 or 3 centuries prior to Europe in this. And there are some historians who have been arguing lately that, look, when the Kerala School of Mathematics was in its heyday with Madhava or Nilakantha and many, many others, all these great mathematicians, and they also had their corresponding astronomy, there were these Jesuits, European Jesuits in Kerala, and since one of the primary objectives or tasks that the Jesuits were on was to take whatever they could understand of the lands they were in back to Europe, that this knowledge must have gone back to Europe, and from there it was to play a role indirectly, although there is no direct evidence. But then all the material that is in the Vatican Library has not been studied by scholars, so we don't know. The proposal has been made that Kerala School of Mathematics did play a role in the development of infinite series, maybe indirectly, maybe it was in the air, just as we do know that the Indian number system took about a couple of centuries to be accepted, the idea of negative numbers, Brahmagupta's stuff, etc. And for a couple of hundred years, when all this came after Fibonacci translated Indian mathematics into Latin, it took a couple of hundred years for it to take root in Europe, because there was opposition by the church to the idea of negative numbers, etc. So it's quite possible that that a similar long period of gestation was what we see in the development of these ideas of infinite series and other stuff that went from India to Europe. Now, since I'm running out of time, I'll just, and we do want to have some questions, I'll briefly mention the fact that Navya Nyaya, which arose in Bihar and Bengal about 1200 years ago, which is a further exposition of Nyaya. And Nyaya, as we know, goes back to centuries BCE, just as Vaisheshika. Navya Nyaya, through George Everest, who was the Surveyor General of India and who had lived in India for 20, 30, 40 years, and who was a kind of a mentor to Charles Babbage, George Boole, and Augustus de Morgan in England, because whenever he would go back to England, he would speak of what he had learned in India. And we have this from Mary Boole, George Boole's wife, who wrote a famous story on this, saying that Navya Nyaya, which is equivalent to mathematical logic, which is at the basis of computer science, and which is at the basis of a lot of other stuff, a lot of engineered sciences of modern times, owes to India in that sense as well. And all these linkages of Navya Nyaya, of Vaisheshika, etc., sadly, after independence, have been ignored. There are no or hardly any departments of history of science, history of Indian science in India. India of the past 70 years is this very tragic story where consciously our elites chose to look away as if there was something horrific to be ashamed of. And while Western scholars have repeatedly gone to India, and of course I spoke of Schrödinger, and Indian scholars also prior to independence, people like C.V. Raman and certainly J.C. Bose and S.N. Bose and others were aware of the Indian tradition after 1947. Apart from George Sudarshan, I don't personally know. Now I'll be more than happy to be corrected here that there are other Indian scholars also who have tried to go back, because you know people like C.V. Raman also wrote their understanding, you know, the epistemology, their understanding of what Indian science was, and that's not happened to the extent it should have happened in recent times. So we do have a great challenge. And hopefully Vivekananda Study Circle and similar institutions would inspire the students there, would inspire their professors and leaders at these institutions. We don't want people to do it just because it's a part of the Indian tradition. No, this is wonderful science. And if it doesn't make sense, you must throw it out of the window. But there are wonderful insights, and these insights might yet play a central role in the development of modern science, because as we know, modern science is in a state of crisis. In physics, you have to postulate 95% of dark matter and dark energy. You don't, in psychology, you don't know where the agent sits, how any agent meaning human agent or any sentient being has freedom. In neuroscience, you don't know what the seat of conscious thought is. What are the neural correlates of awareness? There is no single neural correlate. So all of these crises in all branches of science, and it's quite possible that the idea of consciousness, which is central to Indian thought, which in the Vedas is the central Atma Vidya, because as we know, the Vedas are not in opposition to Apara. It complements, Atma Vidya complements Apara Vidya, and Apara Vidya are all the outer sciences like biochemistry, physics, biology, chemistry, etc., and which keep on accumulating as you obtain new instruments of seeing physical reality. Therefore, in my view, just to conclude, all of this might still play a central role. So my plea to the Vivekananda Study Circle and its leaders would be to create bridges with the leaders of Indian science in India, and at least to have a beginning of departments of history of Indian science, where some of this can be studied with critical thinking, that we must we must embrace once again what is beautiful and wonderful, and doing that might actually not just be good for our sense of feeling good about our own past, but might provide us clues as to how breakthroughs in science for the future should be made. Because as we know, we are on the threshold of a new era where consciousness or machines which do a lot of stuff that human beings do are going to play a greater and greater role. And therefore, this question of what consciousness and awareness is will also be central from that perspective. And once again, in my view, from whatever I know of both modern science, of AI and quantum mechanics, fields in which I actually work, and also of Indian Shastras, perhaps a samanvay, perhaps a coming together could happen, which would make a great difference. And perhaps India, in that sense, could once again become central to this journey of humanity to greater understanding of ourselves. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to address them.
Thank you, Dr. Kak. We are indeed very grateful to you for taking this time out, and it was indeed a very enlightening lecture. So I actually personally have a question before we go to the other questions. So there is this thing called dark matter, which is kind of omnipresent. It's passing through us all the time, and there's such a lot of mystery. And so, do you think that this matter might maybe the properties of this matter has something related to our consciousness?
Okay, yeah, I get your question very well. I understand this whole context. My answer is there are assumptions at the basis of physics which are not questioned. There are assumptions related to, for example, space. Of course, with relativity, you have space which curls, etc., etc. But there are other assumptions also. And it's because of those assumptions, the way we perceive the outer world, right? Through the cosmos, through our telescopes, through study of the electromagnetic spectrum, energy coming in from distant objects, stars, galaxies, etc., etc. There are certain assumptions that have been made, and it's because those assumptions may need to be questioned. That's why we have this current situation where these galaxies are moving much faster than allowed by either Newton's laws or by Einstein's general relativity, which is why you have to postulate dark matter and dark energy. Maybe these assumptions are wrong. Maybe there is no dark matter and dark energy. Maybe if one were to question these assumptions, clarity would be obtained. And my personal take on this is, and I'm in fact in the midst of some work on this. I published one recent paper why space is not three-dimensional, it's E-dimensional, 2.718. There is an information theoretic reason. And the moment you acknowledge or accept this possibility, everything changes. Then non-integer spaces have certain consequences. Everything changes. So my point is, look, the epistemology, and again, to go back as early as 600 BCE, where no Indian scientist is even aware of this epistemology of Vaisheshika Sutras, right? Where it's stated that you must look at this whole question of nature of space itself. Why do we assume that it has certain properties? Just because we have extended our terrestrial intuitions into the entire cosmos. So the question of who the observer is, if you examine this, there may be new possibilities, and that may completely revolutionize physics as we know.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll move on to the other questions.
Hello, sir.
Excuse, may I know who's speaking?
Yes, I am Vasudeva from.
There is too much of echo. There's too much of echo.
Yeah, there's too much of echo. Maybe you can type your question in the chat box so we can have a structured way to take these questions. Is that fine? Yes, sir. So we'll go to the first question where Lokesh asks, we have the theory of Ansh that gets attracted towards the Anshi. Is it somehow related to the theory of gravity?
I don't know what the theory of Ansh is. I haven't heard of it. I don't know what it is.
Sir, my second question is maybe you can throw some light.
Okay. Maybe it elaborates. So, in the light of modern, since we can infer that maybe our forefathers knew about such fascinating facts like the ratio of the sun's diameter to that of Earth, but is there any information as to how they knew these numbers? How can somebody who wants to build on our own knowledge system start his research if he doesn't know the research methodology by which our ancients knew these facts?
Oh yeah. Good question. Well, you know, the relative distance and of the sun or the moon, it's not very difficult to find it. You can come up with a reasonable argument. It's a very good question, because I think generally what happens is in India, because all of Indian Shastras have been placed in a dark room, because people are not aware what is in it. Therefore, there's also this tendency to ascribe everything to Indian sciences, you know, to confuse the metaphor for the literal truth. So if there is a mention of Vimana, to take that as a literal airplane, you know, one must exercise viveka or judgment in all of these questions. In fact, the fact that the sun is 108 times its diameter from the earth can be inferred in two different ways. One would be, you can take a tall pole and move it 108 times its height away from you and ask somebody to hold it up. Its size would be the same as the size of the rising sun or setting sun, and especially on a hazy day, because you can actually look at the sun, you'll see that its size would be the same. Another way to look at the relative sizes would be to look at the time span of a solar eclipse versus a lunar eclipse. In fact, I have a collaborator in London, and we've recently written a paper for a history of science journal where we have come up with possible reasoning related to the Indian Jyotish framework, because we have the framework in Surya Siddhanta, for example, or we have in Jyotish Vedanga or in Aryabhati and so on. So we can use that framework and argue how this would have been obtained, so that it's not something totally out of place. So we should be able to find, you know, what happens is, and I think this is something I argued when I wrote a paper in 1998 discussing the speed of light. You know, Sayanacharya has a mention of speed of light in 2202 yojanas in half a nimesha, which is almost exactly correct as far as the speed of light is concerned. Of course, he's speaking of the speed of the sun at that particular rate, or the distance to the sun from Earth in Vishnu Purana is quite accurate. Quite accurate, because of course we don't know the yojana, should it be 9 miles, or should it be 8 miles or 7.5 miles, etc. There's always that distinction, but ballpark figure is correct. It is possible to come up with arguments which form a reasonable basis, and that's what I tried to do in my paper in 1998, where I argued how within the Puranic framework, the idea of 2,202 yojanas in half a nimesha, which corresponds to the speed of light, could have been fitted in. The larger point I was trying to make was this, that almost all creative thought is spontaneous and it's non-inductive. It comes from out of the box. And so what one normally does, as any creative artist or as any scientist would tell you, is that, hey, I got this idea, I don't know how, and then I try to explain it within the framework of what I knew. So maybe that's how one can explain that these numbers came in, and possibly Sayanacharya or others at that time, or prior to him, because this was actually a much older number, there is a prehistory to it, that an explanation could be fitted into the astronomy, not the Siddhantic astronomy, because there was no role for speed of light or any of that, or how far the sun was, but what my collaborator in London and I now call the other Puranic astronomy, where there was much more of speculative thought. But from a different perspective, the point that we should stress here is this centrality to this whole question of consciousness in Indian thought, that how does understanding or new knowledge emerge? It probably doesn't emerge through simple manipulation of equations or parameters, which is what one does in normal science. As a new PhD student, this is what you're trying to do. But by reaching within your own consciousness, somehow you reach something which takes you to a epistemological ground, which is really in consonance with the framework of the Vedas itself, which Schrödinger, for example, celebrated by talking again and again of this Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that you can obtain it all because it's all within. All knowledge is all within. All of science is all within. All of sciences are ultimately a description of the mind, because we really are not flying off into all corners of the cosmos and looking into it. We are creating these stories, these narratives within our mind, and therefore they take us back to the very center stage, which is the nature of the mind. And of course, in Western science, mind emerges from matter, while in the Vedic sciences or in the Indian tradition, behind the mind is matter, is an instrument, but behind the mind is the Atman.
Sir, it seems that you are hinting that people came to know about these numbers by maybe deep meditation or something. But in that case, I will say that what happened that now nothing new is coming by that methodology. And yeah. And secondly,
okay.
since you talked about Puranas, means I happened to see Bhagavad Puran in our library, and I have gone through this particular skandha about where it is described about the Srishti. So it talk about Sumeru Parvat and many other things, and even by the known, I mean, you talked about 2-3 various definitions of yojan, but if whatever definition of yojan I take, I find that those numbers actually do not make sense. in the light of
Oh,
present knowledge.
absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I get what you're saying. That's the whole point. You're not supposed to take the Puranas literally. All those stories are not to be, those, the Mahadvipas are not to be taken literally. Puranas are a kind of a coded thing, and there you have things, for example, and I do have the specific place where it is mentioned, the distance to the sun is 1.57 into 10 to the power 6 yojanas and so on. And you're absolutely right. You don't have the same yojana used even by Aryabhatta. Aryabhatta's yojana is different from Arthashastra yojana. It was the same in Europe. In Europe, the mile was standardized only recently. In every country, they had their own different version of the mile. So what is important is to use Viveka in looking at all these texts. And the mistake that one often does is to make this mistake of looking at all of that as literal truth, or looking at where is the Sumeru mountain and so on. So you're not to take it literally. And that's the reason why there was this distinction between the Siddhantas, which didn't have any of this coded stuff. Because the whole problem is, the moment you speak of consciousness, you cannot speak of it as a thing, because it's not a thing. And that's why encoded language, in Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, I think Yagyavalkya states, Paroksha Priya Ivhi Devaha Pratyaksha Dvishaha, that the Devas love what is paradoxical, what is Paroksha, and Pratyaksha they hate. And the problem that one falls into, and that's where deep understanding is required, and that's where this error is made again and again within India by people who love India, because they think, hey, here are the Puranas. This is what is in Bhagavad Puranam, and therefore this is what the description is, and this is what must be the literal truth. No, this is not the literal truth. In fact, there's a lot of the stuff in the Puranas which doesn't make any sense at all, because that is not to be taken literally. In fact, that goes back all the way to Nirukta itself. In the Nirukta itself, Yask asks that what are these meghas? Is this megha in the sky, or who's this Twashta? Is he this Asura, or is he within yourself? Are the Asuras outside or they within? And those are the issues also that need to be resolved in any scholarly understanding of the whole Indian knowledge system. When you're doing physics, what you have to do is to look at what is the literal truth, because the literal and the coded are in it together. And that's the reason why you often need instruction from somebody who knows how to separate, how to separate the milk from the water, which is what a Hansa is supposed to do. And that's where one needs judgment. And that's where often the errors are made by people within the Indian tradition, and that brings a lot of ridicule by those who want to throw, by mixing metaphors, throw the baby with the bath water. They throw the whole thing out. We don't want to do it because it doesn't make any sense. We are not going to do any of the Indian stuff after 1947. The left said we don't want to do it because it doesn't make any sense, because such and such stuff doesn't make any sense. That's true. A lot of stuff, but the Shastric part is all scientific. The Shastras are all scientific. But there is other stuff which is more related to the nature of consciousness, and the samavai of the two, which is where the coded stuff comes in, which is where a lot of critical thought needs to be given to separate the milk from the water.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
So we'll get back to the other question that we have from Arpit. And that is, how did people in ancient India become aware of these modern physics concepts with no modern equipment and experimental backing?
What is modern, most modern science is to be traced to, let's say, about 1900, Poincaré, Einstein, and then, of course, the whole quantum mechanical revolution, which has changed the whole world. This revolution was about bringing the observer back into physics. You look at relativity itself, that who the observer is, the speed with which the observer is going makes the difference in relating events, for example. And in quantum mechanics, when the observer interacts with the quantum mechanical state, there's the collapse of the superpositions, right? Now, these are old issues. These are the issues of the observer are central. You don't have to have either microscopes or telescopes to think about these questions. So these are questions which are central to Vedic thought. Vedic thought spoke very clearly about the outer world, the Bahya, and the inner world, the Antarik world, and made this distinction, where does you have these five koshas, the Annamaya, the Pranamaya, the Manomaya kosha, and the Vijnanamaya kosha, and the Anandamaya kosha, and beyond that is the Atman. And this whole classification, the categorization in Kanada's Sutras, for example, is extremely sophisticated. And it could have been done. You don't need any of the modern stuff. Modern stuff is reaching, as the great German historian of art, Heinrich Zimmer, said in his book on Indian art. He says, what the West becomes sometimes terrified by and totally intrigued by is to realize that the West is now, and he died in the 1950s, West is now arriving at a point where the Vedic sages discussed that 500 years before the Common Era. In some of these questions, in fact, there is a statement somewhere by Dalai Lama in one of his lectures, where he says that Western psychology is like KG compared to Indian psychology, to yoga and Ayurveda and all that. And the tragedy is that India doesn't know itself. Indian colleges and universities don't know their own knowledge. It's not just physics is at a crisis because of dark matter and dark energy. Modern medicine is at a crisis. Allopathy, which is Western medicine, which is based on treatment of symptoms, is at a crisis. And if you read my essay on it with all the citations, you'll see that 70 to 90% of clinical research cannot be replicated because of various reasons, and also because of partly the pressure of pharma. This is a big asuric force. They want things to be done. They want people to be on drugs because there are profits to be made, even though those drugs may not work. And most of these drugs later on for chronic illnesses, not for infectious diseases, etc. For chronic illnesses, these things don't work. And then there's this whole thing of just by believing that you would get well, you will get well. 30 to 40% of the people get well just by believing that they will get well, and this is the so-called placebo effect. You have the placebo and the nocebo effects because Western medicine leaves out the mind, and Ayurveda does include the mind. But the problem with even Ayurveda in India, now you have the Ayush ministry, is that you're still only hanging on to Charak Samhita or Ashtanga Hridaya or Sushruta Samhita. These things have to be brought into a modern narrative. You cannot just hold on. All of the Indian texts in all of the sciences, the Shastras, have to be made a part of contemporary discourse. But the tragedy is that contemporary Indian scientists don't know any of this, and therefore they're not able to discuss them, with exceptions, and those exceptions have done wonderful work. In fact, I was just talking to the nephew of Harish Chandra, who lives in the US, and Harish Chandra, as you know, is one of the great mathematicians of this past century, of the 20th century. And Harish Chandra, according to his nephew, says was inspired by the Indian knowledge system. So that is what was guiding his intuition. Or you look at the great Ramanujan. Ramanujan was guided by his intuition. He would say that, well, I see all this Namagiri or Namakal, the goddess Namagiri tells me or dictates these equations to me in my sleep or in my dreaming. We at least should give some, we should have a framework. We should not believe any of this literally, but we should have a framework where we can go back and relate. First of all, I'm not even saying teach all of this as something that people have to get their degrees in. Should at least have a curriculum of history of Indian science, where all this can be examined with a critical eye, so that this becomes a doorway for people to relate, to get into any of to these disciplines. And who knows, at least this is my personal belief, that this idea from Kanada himself, and I know this very well because as you know, I translated Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras 4 years ago. And the way Kanada looks at space and time, etc., provide us at least the beginning of questioning the implicit assumptions that are a part of modern physics. And there is always a possibility that that would be the doorway to bring in, to give a greater role to the observer, which might make all the difference in going to the next breakthrough. Just as 100 years ago, what Einstein did and what Schrödinger did was that breakthrough at that moment, which also gave a greater role to the observer in both relativity theory and in quantum mechanics.
Okay. Yes. But just one question. How would you say that, how can one person actually develop that intuition? I mean, maybe some people are people born with that gift, because a major part of intuition is played in most of these developments.
Good question. The answer to that is, let's go back to Karya Virodhi Karma. To every action there's an opposite reaction. So we are all bound in this chain of karma, right? Karma is reaction. We're always reacting. So the standard Western psychology view would be that you have a certain conditioning. You're born with a certain temperament, which is what you inherit through your genes, right? And your earliest upbringing, when you're raised, the first 2 years are very critical. Then the experiences you have in school and college, etc., etc. And then you're only reacting. You're like a automaton, right? You're reacting to various stimuli, and then based on who you are able to do things in a particular way. Vedic system is all this with a difference. And what is the difference? The difference is that you can obtain freedom from this karmic chain. And how do you get freedom from this karmic chain? Is through moksha. And moksha is not after death. Moksha is now. If you are able to uncover your manas, because manas has all these coverings, the avarans, right? And these avarans let only some light come through into you, so you can only see things hazily, right? And that is through your conditioning. But if you can uncover it fully, then suddenly you have access. Then that's when you have total mukti. You are free from this chain. And that's what the very heart of the Veda is. Then that is when you are like a deva yourself. That's when you represent the will of the devas, right? then you are a manifestation of Ishvara. That is when you can sing in ecstasy, Shivoham, Shivoham, or Soham, as in Ishavasya Upanishad. That is when you have that capacity. Not only, first of all, you are transformed, you have become Shiva, you have discovered the true Shiva nature of yourself. The whole problem is that you have forgotten that you're Shiva. Get that? And that's when you become the greatest scientist. The moment you're a Shiva, the moment you discover that you're Shiva, that's when you have that intuition. Because that intuition is your, pratibha. Pratibha, you have that light. That light shows you where you have to go.
Okay. So we'll just have a couple or maybe 3 more questions as we are running out of time. So here's one question. The Nyaya scholars like Udayana look at darshana as serving the purpose of knowledge leading to moksha while involving the study of padartha and the world at large. We see a pattern of science and philosophy coming together in a package. Do we see such a pattern in Western philosophical texts as well?
Oh, of course. All human beings are looking for light, prakasha, right? And in fact, in Shaiva Darshan, Kashmir, I'm from Kashmir, as you know, Shiva is also called prakasha. And the body, the mind or the Devi is vimarsha. You have prakasha and vimarsha. You have light and the reflection of the light, right? And certainly all human beings are the same. In the West as well, there have been efforts by all the sages there to approach the truth. But generally, for example, after Aristotle, there was this straitjacket which stopped people for some time. And the problem was that the Aristotelian system was embraced by Christianity. Prior to that, there was more freedom. You had Plato, and Plato also spoke of ideals. He spoke of shadows on the cave, and you only had access to the shadows. And from the shadows, you had to infer what the infinite was. And then you had Aristotelian ideas. They constricted Europe for 1,000 years until there was enlightenment, and Aristotle was also adopted by Islam. So you had similar constriction. But then once Europe broke free, enlightenment, they discovered their own past, and that past had a lot of parallels with India. But I must say, there is a distinction of degree. You go back to Greece and you are looking at India. The difference is that in ancient Greece, which is of course what is called pagan Greece, there is not as much of an emphasis to this idea of Atman. Your Zeus, they're also viewed, or Dyaus in Sanskrit, Zeus sitting in the skies, but things are perceived more in terms of bodies, while ultimately, even though in popular Hinduism or in popular Vedas, you might look at all the deities more in anthropomorphic terms, but you go back to the very heart of the Upanishads, the Vedas, and all the thinking all in the Shastras, there is total clarity that beyond the Sagun, there is the Nirguna, right? Beyond all these categories, which are embodiments, there is something which is ineffable, which cannot be which is infinite, which is the yardstick in a paradoxical way, beyond which, with respect to which everything that we have, of which we are a part, is measured, which gives us that sense. So to come back to the question, yes, the West is the best of the West is fantastic. I love the West as well. I also know the West very well. I know Western literature also very well, and Western art very well, and love the West as well. We must love India to also love the West. We are not rejecting the West. the tragedy of India of the past 70 or 80 years is that somehow shallow people, activists who were part of some political movement, since they didn't understand India, they loved whatever was happening in the politics of the West at that time, socialism or communism. They said, we must reject, India is bad, we must throw it out of the window. And that's what was done. But fortunately, I think a reawakening is taking place. And I hope and believe that Vivekananda Study Circle is a part of that, because India was not totally lost. India was still alive. If it was not in the academy and in the colleges and universities, it was still alive in the knowledge, the intuitions of our grandmothers and our mothers. In villages, people have tremendous insight. It was still alive there. It was alive in ashrams. There were people, the sadhus, living their own thing. So it was still alive at places. And now I believe it's coming back. And as it comes back, it's all over the world now. You go to any corner of the world, people are doing yoga, probably attracted first through asanas and physical well-being, but knowing full well that that's only a doorway to going within. So India was kept alive outside of the academy for 70 years. And I'm hoping that at least it should be given its due place. We should not reject the West. We should keep everything of the best of the West as well. But please give a proper place to our own Shastras, which are wonderful, which have been condemned wrongfully by calling them, superstition, etc. They're not superstition. They are the greatest, and they have also inspired the greatest thinkers in the West in the past 3 or 4 centuries. You look at the greatest artists, you look at the greatest scientists, not just Schrödinger. You look at Andre Way, the great mathematician. Some people say the greatest mathematician in the past 100 years. He studied Sanskrit on his own. He claimed that all of this was absolutely fundamental to his development as a mathematician. So let's go back and be connected to it and still use judgment, because that is what will help us develop our intuition. That's when we will know things for what they are.
So we'll just go to one last question and then we'll end this session. So here's another from Shuman Joy. Where can we place Gödel's proof of God, his incompleteness theorems, in the context of Upanishadic vision of Brahman, where Brahman is considered as aparameya, not known by any valid means of knowledge?
Oh, absolutely. Gödel's incompleteness theorem, you go back to Mundak Upanishad itself, aprameya, Brahman is aprameya. You have apara and para. The whole idea of paroksha I mentioned. In fact, in my own stuff, my book, which I wrote in 1986 called The Nature of Physical Reality, and the intuition was really this central intuition that there is always in all of scientific reasoning, in all formal systems, you have a point beyond which you have paradoxes. And that is the very central idea of all of Indian thought. There is this very famous dialogue, I think it is in the Bhagavatam, between Narad and Yudhishthir. And Yudhishthir asks Narada as to how does one really learn things, or how does one develop oneself? And Narada tells him that, look, you must go and study, and whatever the study is, it's like, going to college and school, until you reach a point where you reach paroksha, where that leads to a paradox, that leads to something which cannot be explained within that framework. And in fact, that is the very central idea of the 6 darshanas itself. The 6 darshanas are not contradictory to each other. Sometimes, Vedantins say, hey, we don't care for Vaisheshika. It has certain such problems. But that is totally, that is, they're not the greatest Vedantins would do that. These are complementary views. Vaisheshika is one view. And at the end of Vaisheshika itself, you'll have paradox. So is Nyaya, so is Sankhya, so is Mimamsa, right? So is yoga. So, and then you have Vedanta. So these are all complementary views, and the complementarity of these views needs to be stressed so that then people realize where to place their own understanding in the larger context.
Okay. There are really lovely questions, but we have run out of time. So I think there is, just a second. So I guess not to answer Shankadeep's question, but there are really very good questions which I can find, but we have run out of time. So until and unless the organizers or maybe Dr. Kak would be okay, I think we'll have to end this session.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm
So,
glad I had this opportunity to speak to all of you. I can only say by concluding that
yes.
all this is so magnificent and wonderful. As someone, I can speak from personal knowledge, as someone who knows the West very well and knows India very well as well. There is nothing in the world as extraordinary as Indian knowledge, Indian insights, Indian wisdom, and let's embrace it. Only when you love India would you also be able to love others. If only you love yourself can you love somebody is also true in one's personal life. So India is great. So please do whatever you can to persuade your leadership at your colleges and universities to at least establish departments of history of Indian science so that all of this is given. Let our youth have an opportunity to know this. And if they don't like it, great. But at least they should be given an opportunity to know all of this beautiful, beautiful stuff.
Yes. So, Dr. Kak, is there any way people can get in touch with you regarding your questions?
Well, I can't address all questions. The best thing would be I've probably anticipated a lot of these questions in my writings. If you read my books or read my essays, and my books are literally free on the internet. Some copy of it is circulating on some website. All of my books are literally free, or you can go to my essays on medium.com, which are also free. And almost all the questions that you have, you'll see that they are addressed there. And as to the questions related to dark matter and dark energy, I have some new scientific papers coming out, and there should be something very, very exciting on it very soon.
Yeah. Okay, sir.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, and have a very good day and next few days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So thanks to all the participants for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't get all your questions through, but please feel to